After my husband divorced me, I left without a word, and seconds later, a billionaire's limo pulled up for me at the bottom of the courthouse steps. My name is Marin Calloway, 41 years old, an ER nurse who spent 12 years holding a marriage together with the same steady hands I used to hold dying strangers back from the edge. That morning, my husband Derek signed the papers, slid them across the table and told me to walk home, that I'd leave with nothing, the same nothing he swore I came into his life with. His new woman waited in the hallway in heels that cost more than my monthly scrubs budget. He didn't even look up when I stood. He thought he was watching a nurse walk out into the cold with empty hands. But Derek never knew the truth about the woman he married. He never knew that the nothing he threw in my face was a choice I made at 22. The day I walked away from a name, a fortune, and an empire I never wanted. He never knew that the moment he filed those papers, a door I'd locked 19 years ago quietly swung back open. So when that limousine glided up to the curb and the driver opened the door and called me by a name Derek had never once heard me use, who do you think was really walking away with nothing? What did I give up all those years ago that Derek would have killed to inherit? And why was a billionaire's car waiting for the wife he'd just thrown away? The courtroom smelled like old paper and cold coffee. Fluorescent light buzzed over our heads, flat and merciless. The kind of light that makes everyone look guilty of something. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the same way I used to fold them outside a family conference room before telling someone their father wasn't going to make it. Steady. Still. A nurse learns to keep her face quiet even when the room is falling apart. Derek didn't look like a man ending a marriage. He looked like a man closing a business deal he'd already celebrated the night before. New haircut. New watch. A blue suit I'd never seen, cut sharp at the shoulders, paid for, I would learn later, by someone else's money. Someone who was, at that very moment, waiting outside in the hallway in a cream dress and heels that clicked like a countdown against the marble floor. Her name was Priya. She was 29. She worked in marketing at the firm Derek had been trying to impress for the last 2 years. I found out about her the way I find out about most things in my life, quietly, and too late to stop the bleeding. You'll want to sign here, the mediator said, sliding the pen across the table like it weighed nothing. Derek signed first. His signature was fast, careless. A man in a hurry to get to the rest of his life. I signed second. My hand didn't shake. 12 years of holding needles steady over veins that were about to collapse had taught me that. When it was done, Derek finally looked at me. Not with guilt. Not even with cruelty exactly. Just a flat, tired kind of relief, like a man setting down a bag he'd been carrying too long. "Walk home, Marin," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, but sharp enough to cut. "You came into this with nothing. You're leaving with nothing. That's fair, isn't it?" I didn't answer him. I stood, smoothed the front of my coat, and walked out of that courtroom the same way I walk into a code blue. Steady, unhurried, present. Because a long time ago, someone taught me that the moment you let your voice shake, you hand the other person the last thing you own. Out in the hallway, Priya was waiting, scrolling her phone, already halfway into the next chapter of a life she thought she'd earned. She glanced up at me once. Just once. The kind of look you give someone you've already decided isn't a threat. I understood that look. I'd worn a version of it myself once, a long time ago, before I knew better. I pushed through the courthouse doors into a gray Tuesday morning. The cold hit my face first, then the noise of the street. A bus hissing to a stop, someone's heels tapping fast on wet concrete, a car horn 2 blocks over. Ordinary sounds. The sound of a city that didn't know or care that my whole life had just been signed away on a folding table under bad lighting. I stood at the top of the steps for a second, the way you stand at the edge of a pool before deciding whether the water is going to be cold. 19 years of my old life sat behind a door I'd locked at 22, and some small, stubborn part of me had always known that one day, something would knock hard enough to open it again. I didn't know it would be this hard, or this soon. I started down the steps. My phone buzzed once in my coat pocket. A text I wouldn't read for another 10 minutes, because I didn't know yet that it mattered. I was thinking about rent, about double shifts, About whether Derek was already imagining what he'd say to his new firm colleagues about the ex-wife who used to wipe down bedpans for a living, back before she became inconvenient. And that's when I heard it. Tires on wet pavement, slow and deliberate. Not the rushed screech of city traffic, but something gliding. Something that didn't belong on this block any more than a swan belongs in a gutter. I turned, and there it was, black, long, polished so clean it threw back a warped reflection of the courthouse steps and my own startled face. A Rolls-Royce, parked at the curb like it had always been there, like it had been waiting for this exact second for a very long time. The driver stepped out first. Older man, gray at the temples, dressed in a suit that looked like it had never once known a wrinkle. He didn't glance at the courthouse. He didn't glance at Derek, who I could feel behind me now, standing at the top of the steps with Priya's hand suddenly still on his arm. The driver looked directly at me. "Ms. Calloway," he said. Not Mrs. Whitfield. Not the name I'd worn on a wedding certificate for 12 years. The name that had just been legally peeled off me 20 minutes earlier. Calloway. A name I hadn't heard out loud, spoken to my face, in 19 years. A name that belonged to a 19-year-old girl who once stood in a hospital hallway and decided she didn't want any part of what came with it. Behind me, I heard Derek's voice, thinner than I'd ever heard it. "Whose car is that?" I didn't turn around. I couldn't, not yet. Not while my chest was doing something complicated and my throat had gone tight in a way it hadn't since the night my grandfather stopped recognizing my face. The driver opened the rear door, and inside, in the dim leather quiet, I could see the silhouette of someone waiting. A woman, sharp-suited, a leather folio resting on her knee like she'd been holding it there for hours, maybe years. "Your grandfather's attorney has been trying to reach you for 11 days, the driver said gently, like he already knew this would knock the air out of me. "She has something she needs you to hear before the filing goes public. I couldn't wait for tomorrow. 11 days. My grandfather." The words landed strange in my mouth even just hearing them, like language I used to speak fluently and had almost let myself forget. "My grandfather passed 6 months ago," I said quietly, mostly to make sure it was still true, mostly to make sure I hadn't imagined the funeral I never attended, the flowers I never sent, the calls I let go to voicemail because some doors, once you lock them, you convince yourself you did it for good reason. "Yes, ma'am," the driver said. "And this morning, the moment your divorce was entered into public record, a clause in his estate activated. One he wrote himself. One he'd been waiting 19 years to use." Behind me, I heard Priya's voice, small and confused. "Derek. Derek. Who is she?" I turned back once. Just once. Derek stood frozen at the top of the courthouse steps. The same steps where 20 minutes earlier he'd told me I was leaving with nothing. And for the first time in 12 years of marriage, I watched something crack across his face that had never been there before. Doubt. I climbed into the car. The door shut behind me with a soft, expensive click, sealing out the cold, the noise, the man who thought he knew exactly what he was throwing away. He had no idea. Not yet. And neither, really, did I, not fully, not until the woman beside me opened that leather folio, looked at me with something between grief and relief, and said the 4 words that would unravel everything I thought I understood about the family I walked away from, the fortune I refused, and the reason my grandfather waited 19 years, and one perfectly timed morning, to finally bring me home. "He knew this day," she said, "would come." Before we go further into Marin's story, I need to say something real quick. My ex-husband once told me I'd never make it to 7,000 subscribers on this channel. So if you're here, and this story is pulling you in, prove him wrong with me. Hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell, so you never miss the next chapter. Now back to Marin. The leather seat was cool against my back, and the world outside went soft and muffled the moment that door sealed shut. No more courthouse noise. No more Derek's voice cracking on the top step. Just the low hush of an engine that barely made a sound, and the woman beside me, holding a folio like it was something fragile and important at the same time. "My name is Diane Farrow," she said. "I was your grandfather's attorney for the last 22 years, and before that I was his friend." I studied her face. Kind eyes, tired in the corners, the look of someone who'd been carrying a secret so long it had started to weigh on her posture. Then you know why I left, I said. Not a question. I know what you told him, Diane said carefully. That you didn't want the company, the board seat, the name on hospital wings and scholarship funds. You wanted to be a nurse, not an heiress standing behind a velvet rope shaking hands with people who'd never touched a patient in their life. Hearing it said out loud, plainly, after 19 years of silence, felt like pressing on an old bruise that never fully healed. I looked out the tinted window as the car pulled away from the curb, past the courthouse steps where Derek still stood frozen, past Priya's stunned, uncertain face, past the whole life I just signed out of 20 minutes earlier. I was 22, I said quietly. I watched my grandfather build Callaway Medical from a single supply warehouse into something that put equipment in half the hospitals on the East Coast. And I watched what it did to him. Board meetings that ran past midnight. Family dinners where he'd stare at his plate doing math in his head. My mother resenting every single dollar because it came with strings she could never quite see, until they'd already tightened around her neck. Diane nodded slowly. He never blamed you for walking away. He should have, I said. I broke his heart the day I told him I was becoming a nurse instead of taking the seat he built for me. He didn't see it that way, Diane said. He used to tell me that watching you choose your own hard road instead of his easy one was the proudest moment of his life. He just never knew how to say that to your face without sounding like he was trying to pull you back in. My throat tightened. Outside the window, the city blurred past. Gray buildings, wet streets, a version of my life I'd built brick by brick with 12-hour shifts and a marriage I thought was solid ground. A marriage that had just crumbled under me in a room that smelled like old coffee. There's something you need to understand before we get to the estate, Diane said, opening the folio at last. 19 years ago, when you walked away, your grandfather didn't just let you go quietly. He restructured the entire family trust around a single condition. One he built specifically for you and only you. What condition? That the moment you filed for divorce or divorce was filed against you, full control of your original inheritance would activate automatically. No waiting period, no board approval, no chance for anyone to argue you out of it. I stared at her. Why would he build that in? Diane's eyes softened in a way that made my chest ache before she even answered. Because he watched Derek at your wedding, Marin. Just for one afternoon. And he saw something in the way that man looked at you that worried him for the rest of his life. The words landed like a stone dropping into still water. I thought back to that wedding, 7 years into knowing Derek, my grandfather sitting quietly in the third row, saying very little, smiling politely at all the right moments. I'd assumed his silence back then was disapproval of my choice to marry outside the world he understood. I never once considered it might have been something closer to fear. He saw a man who loved the idea of what your name could become for him more than he loved you, Diane said. He never told you because he didn't want to be the bitter old man trying to control your life from the sidelines. So instead, he built a door. Quietly, legally. And he waited. For 19 years. Hoping he'd never have to open it. I felt something crack loose in my chest. Something I'd kept sealed shut since the day of that wedding. Since long before that. Maybe since the day I was a little girl watching my grandfather come home exhausted every night from a company he built with nothing but stubbornness and a warehouse loan. Grief and something else underneath it. Recognition. The unbearable ache of being understood by someone who never said it out loud while he was alive to hear you say it back. He's been gone 6 months, I whispered. Why didn't anyone contact me before now? Because that was the other condition he set, Diane said gently. He didn't want you pulled back into this world out of grief, or guilt, or obligation. He wanted you to keep living exactly the life you chose, for as long as that life was still working. The clause only activates the moment that life stops being safe for you. The moment somebody tries to take something from you that isn't theirs to take. Outside, rain had started, fine and quiet against the windshield, blurring the skyline into soft gray streaks. I thought of Derek's voice on the courthouse steps. You came into this with nothing. You're leaving with nothing. He'd meant it as the final word. He had no idea he was standing on the very trigger my grandfather built 19 years ago. waiting patiently in the dark for exactly this morning. What exactly did I just inherit? I asked, my voice steadier now, the nurse and me taking back the wheel from the daughter and granddaughter still reeling in the back seat. Diane turned a page in the folio and slid it toward me. Numbers. Property deeds. A 23% controlling share in Callaway Medical Holdings, currently valued at just over $310 million. A private foundation funding rural hospital equipment grants across 4 states. A seat, waiting and untouched for 19 years, on a board that hadn't filled it because my grandfather refused to let anyone else sit in the chair he'd built with my name on the plaque. I sat with that number for a long moment, feeling strangely disconnected from it, the way you feel disconnected from a diagnosis read aloud about someone else's body. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like grief wearing a very expensive coat. There's one more thing, Diane said, and something in her tone made me look up sharply. Your grandfather had people watching quietly over the years, not to control you, just to make sure you were safe. 6 months ago, right before he passed, one of our internal auditors flagged something unusual. A loan application, using Callaway family collateral that Derek should never have had access to. The floor of my stomach dropped out. What are you talking about? 3 months ago, Diane said, Derek approached a private lender using documents that referenced a family trust connection through marriage. He was trying to leverage a relationship to your grandfather's company that legally expired the day you two divorced, which, as of this morning, is now a matter of fraud. I stared at her, my mind racing back through months I thought I understood completely. The late nights Derek said were work dinners. The new watch, the blue suit, the confidence of a man who thought he already knew exactly how this story was going to end. Standing at the top of those courthouse steps telling me I was leaving with nothing. He didn't know the truth about the woman he married. And he had absolutely no idea what he'd just tried to steal from a dead man who'd spent 19 years quietly making sure his granddaughter would never again have to walk down a set of cold marble steps with empty hands. The car slowed, turning off the wet avenue onto a private drive lined with old oak trees, and through the windshield I caught my first glimpse of a house I hadn't seen since I was 22 years old, standing in its doorway telling my grandfather I didn't want any of it. I had no idea, stepping out of that car, that the truth waiting for me inside would be so much bigger and so much more painful than a fraud allegation against the man who just tried to leave me with nothing. Before I go there, does this direction feel right to you? If yes, I'll move into scene 3. What's really waiting inside that house? The full truth about Derek's fraud and the emotional reckoning that brings this story home. The rain had stopped by the time the car eased up the last stretch of that private drive, and the house rose in front of me the way memories do. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one landing a little harder than the last. Stone steps I used to skip 2 at a time. A wide oak door with a brass handle worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. The same wind chime still hanging from the porch beam, older now, quieter, but still singing the same tired note they'd sung the last time I stood here at 22, telling my grandfather I didn't want his company, his fortune, or the life he'd built for me. I hadn't expected the smell to hit me first. Cedar and old paper and, faintly, the memory of his pipe tobacco, though he'd quit that habit a decade before he died. Grief has a strange way of hiding in scent, waiting patiently in doorframes for you to walk back through them. Diane led me into the study, and that's where I stopped breathing for a second, because sitting behind the old walnut desk, very much alive and very much not expecting me either, was a woman I hadn't seen in 19 years. My mother. She stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Marin. Just my name. Said the way you'd say it to someone you weren't sure was really standing in front of you. You knew about this, I said. Not angry. Just tired, the way you get tired after holding your spine straight through an entire 12-hour shift. I've known for 6 months, she said. Since the reading of the will. I wanted to call you. Diane told me to wait. She said your grandfather was very specific about how this had to happen. Her eyes were wet, and for the first time since I was a teenager, I saw something in my mother's face that wasn't disappointment. It looked almost like relief. Diane set the folio down on the desk and opened it to a page I hadn't seen yet. There's a letter, she said quietly. He wrote it 4 years ago and updated it twice since, most recently 8 months before he passed. He asked me to read it to you myself when this day came, not before. I sat down slowly in the chair across from the desk, the same chair I used to sit in as a little girl, swinging my legs, waiting for him to finish a phone call so we could go feed the horses down at the property line. My mother sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, closer than we'd been in years. Diane cleared her throat and began to read. My dearest Marin, if you're hearing this, it means the marriage I worried about at your wedding has ended, and I am no longer here to hold you while it happens. I am sorry for that, more than you will ever know. I know you walked away from this family's business because you watched it cost me pieces of myself I never got back. I want you to know that watching you become exactly the kind of woman who runs toward dying strangers instead of running toward money was the single proudest thing I have ever witnessed in my life. You did not disappoint me by leaving. You saved yourself by leaving. I only regret that I built my love for you into deeds and dollars instead of simply saying it plainly, the way I should have, every single day you were still in this house. My mother reached over and took my hand. I let her. Diane continued. I watched Derek Whitfield at your wedding for exactly one afternoon, and it was enough. I saw a man look at the Calloway name the way a man looks at a house he intends to renovate, not a woman he intends to cherish. I hoped I was wrong. I built protections in case I wasn't. I am sorry that being right cost you 12 years of your life. I am sorrier still that it took this long for you to be free of him. But Marin, hear me clearly. You are not walking away from that marriage with nothing. You never once, in your whole life, walked away with nothing. You walked away with exactly the kind of woman I always hoped you would become. And now you are walking toward everything I built to make sure the rest of your life is easier than the first half of it had to be. My hands were shaking now, and I let them. There is one final matter, Diane said, her voice shifting into something more careful, more legal. Regarding the fraud. My mother's grip tightened on my hand. 3 months ago, Diane continued, Derek Whitfield applied for an $800,000 business loan using documents that falsely represented an active financial relationship with Calloway Medical Holdings through marriage. Your grandfather's estate flagged the application immediately, because the paperwork referenced a family trust account that had already been legally sealed the day he passed. Derek believed he was borrowing against a connection that still existed. He had no idea it had already been severed months earlier, quietly, the same way everything in this family has always been handled, quietly and on time. What happens to him? I asked. That, Diane said, is entirely your decision. The estate can pursue this as fraud, which would almost certainly end his career and very likely result in criminal charges. Or you can let it go, and simply let the loan application collapse under its own weight when the lender discovers the trust connection no longer exists. I thought about Derek standing at the top of those courthouse steps, telling me I was leaving with nothing, the same courthouse steps where a Rolls-Royce had pulled up to prove exactly how wrong he was. I thought about Priya's confused face, about the new watch, about 12 years of feeling small in rooms where Derek wanted to feel big. And underneath all of it, I felt the old pull, the one every human being feels when someone finally hands them the power to hurt the person who hurt them. But I also thought about my grandfather's letter, about a man who built an empire and still wished, at the very end, that he'd simply said I love you more plainly instead of building it into deeds and dollars. About what it would mean to spend the first day of my new life pouring energy into revenge instead of into something that actually mattered. Let it collapse on its own, I said finally. I don't need to destroy him. I just need him to understand, eventually, exactly what he threw away without ever knowing what it was. Diane nodded slowly, something like respect settling into her expression. Your grandfather said you'd choose that. He said you always did have his stubbornness and your grandmother's mercy in equal measure. 6 months later, I stood on a small wooden platform outside a rural hospital 2 hours from where I used to work double shifts in the ER, cutting a ribbon on a new pediatric wing funded by the Calloway Family Foundation. My mother stood beside me. Diane stood a few feet back, quietly proud. And in the crowd, unexpected but somehow exactly right, stood a man named Josh, a paramedic I'd worked beside for 6 years, who used to bring me coffee during the worst overnight shifts and never once needed me to be anything other than exactly who I was. Derek's loan had collapsed exactly the way Diane predicted. Quietly, without headlines, without a single dollar of his stolen dream ever landing in his hands. I heard, secondhand, through people who still knew people, that his engagement to Priya had ended not long after the truth came out about where his money really was and wasn't coming from. I felt nothing when I heard that. Not satisfaction, not cruelty, just a quiet, settled kind of peace. The same peace you feel when a patient you fought hard for finally stabilizes, and you can finally breathe out. I thought of my grandfather often in those months, standing behind that walnut desk in my memory, and I understood something I hadn't understood at 22. He never wanted me to inherit a company. He wanted me to inherit the freedom to walk away from anything and anyone that made me feel like I was worth nothing. And in the end, that's exactly what he gave me. Not the money, the freedom underneath it. Derek stood at the top of those courthouse steps and told me I'd leave with nothing. He had no idea that nothing was never true. Not that morning. Not for one single day of my whole life. Because the people who truly love us leave behind more than money. They leave behind proof that we were seen all along, even when we thought no one was watching. So here's what I want to ask you, the people watching this story right now, wherever you are tonight. If everything you built your identity around was suddenly stripped away in one cold room, would you know, deep down, exactly who you still are underneath it? Or would you need someone else's letter, someone else's love, to remind you that you were never really starting from nothing at all? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is right where you are. I read every single one of them, and it means more to me than you know that this story found its way to you.